There is a moment you don't remember, but your body does. A moment where a piece of you went silent. It wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It didn't announce its exit. It just stopped being welcomed. And from that moment on, a part of you began to disappear, not physically, but psychologically, spiritually, existentially. You didn't bury it. You just turned away. Life asked you to move on, and you did. But something inside you never followed. Now, when you're alone, truly alone, when there's no one left to perform, for no mirror to adapt to, no expectation to obey, there's a strange ache you can't explain. It doesn't hurt like a wound. It haunts like a forgotten name. It lingers beneath your skin like a dream you almost remember, but can't quite place. That is the part of you you abandoned. And it's still waiting. Not because it's weak, but because it was never meant to survive without you. You might think you're lost because you haven't found your purpose or because you haven't reached your potential. But the truth is, you feel lost because you're not whole. Not psychologically, not spiritually, not emotionally. And wholeness isn't something you chase in the world. It's something you remember within yourself. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." But it's more than terrifying. It's devastating. Because to reclaim the parts of you you've forgotten, you have to return to the places where you first left them behind. And most people would rather run forever than face that. So ask yourself, when did you stop singing without shame? When did you begin to hide your anger, your joy, your chaos, your honesty? When did you decide your sadness was too much for others to hold? When did you decide your truth was inconvenient, dangerous, or embarrassing? And who taught you that it didn't happen all at once? It happened in fragments. One small betrayal of your spirit at a time. A moment where you needed love, but got silence. A moment where you expressed joy, but were met with scorn. A moment where you told the truth and were punished for it. And over time, you learned a terrible rule. Survival requires fragmentation. You became a version of yourself that was allowed. A shape you hoped would be loved. But in the process, you turned your soul into a storage room, locking away the impulses, emotions, dreams, and instincts that didn't fit the narrative. And now, years later, you feel like a stranger to yourself, not because you're broken, but because you've been edited. But the soul doesn't forget. It waits, patiently, sometimes painfully, in symptoms, in dreams, in obsessions and unexplained longings. It waits in the person you can't let go of, in the art you feel drawn to but never pursue, in the shame you avoid but can't stop feeling. These are not accidents. They are messages from the parts of you you've left behind. Jung called this the shadow, the repository of the forgotten self, not just the negative, not just the dark, but everything that has been rejected by consciousness. Everything the ego has deemed unacceptable, even if it was essential. And until you face your shadow, until you open that forbidden door, you will never feel truly alive. Because aliveness comes from integration, not from performance. You are not here to become something other than what you are. You are here to become what you've always been, but have forgotten how to access. The self is not a construction project. It is an excavation. And what you are digging for is not something new, it's something ancient. Something original. Something sacred. But here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Reclaiming these parts of yourself will cost you. It will cost you your current identity. It will cost you the love that was based on your silence. It will cost you the approval that came from being what others needed you to be. It will cost you certainty, comfort, and control. But what you will gain in return is your soul. And the soul is not polite. It is not efficient. It is not productive or impressive in the ways the modern world demands. The soul is slow, messy, wild. It speaks in symbols. It moves in contradictions. It wounds you to wake you. It breaks you to rebuild you. And if you want to reclaim it, you have to become fluent in its language again. You have to let the silence speak. You have to stop filling every moment with noise and distractions. Because beneath all your scrolling, all your pretending, all your striving, there is a voice that hasn't been heard in years. It's the voice of the real you. The one who remembers. The one who knows where you buried yourself. And it's whispering still. Not in grand revelations, but in subtle discomforts. The conversations that leave you feeling hollow. The careers that look good, but feel wrong. The relationships that mirror your wounds instead of your worth. These are not failures. These are signals. Signals that the life you're living is too small for the self you've forgotten. And if you want to remember not just intellectually, but viscerally, you must first sit in the discomfort. You must admit that something vital is missing. Not because you're broken, but because you've outgrown your amnesia. Reclamation begins in stillness, in honest reflection, in letting the silence become a mirror, one that doesn't flatter, but reveals. A mirror that shows you not just who you are, but who you were before the world told you who to be. And once you see that, once you feel the ache of the missing parts, you will have a choice. To turn away again, or to begin the journey inward. Reclaiming what you've forgotten is not a moment of triumph. It is a crossing, a psychological threshold where the ego trembles and the unconscious begins to stir. Most people think awakening feels like enlightenment. But the truth is, it feels like grief. Because what you're reclaiming isn't just potential. It's pain. It's the pain you suppressed in order to survive. The pain that came from realizing you weren't loved as you were. The pain of being too much or not enough. The pain of watching your authenticity cause discomfort, rejection, or punishment. And that pain didn't disappear. It went inward. It disguised itself as anxiety, as people-pleasing, as emotional numbness. It became the background hum of your life, the constant sense that something is off, but you can't explain why. To reclaim the parts of you you've forgotten, you must go back through that pain, not around it. This is what Jung meant when he said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Because the parts of you that were abandoned didn't just vanish. They froze in time, trapped in the moment you left them. And they've been waiting for your return, not with resentment, but with aching loyalty. They still believe in you, even if you don't. But you cannot reclaim them intellectually. You cannot journal your way back to wholeness. You cannot watch enough content, read enough quotes, or repeat enough affirmations to undo years of psychological fragmentation. You must feel your way back. You must go into the body, the one that stored everything your mind couldn't handle. The body that held your screams in its jaw, that buried your tears in its gut, that locked your truth in its shoulders. And when you begin to feel again, you will be overwhelmed. That's not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign you're finally listening. The parts of you you've forgotten are not just memories. They are moods, instincts, voices, desires. The way you used to laugh without fear of being judged. The way you used to speak with no apology. The way you used to create before you believed you had to be good at it. These are not frivolous traits. They are the fingerprints of your original self, And without them, everything you build will feel hollow. Your success will feel empty. Your relationships will feel performative. Your life will feel like a mask you can't remove, because it is. To remove it, you must do something radical. You must stop chasing the self the world rewards and start honoring the self the world forgot. That means saying no to roles you've outgrown. It means grieving the life you built from fear. It means walking away from the dynamics where your silence was more loved than your truth. And yes, it will feel like death. Because in many ways it is. It is the death of the persona, the carefully crafted identity you created to be accepted. And as Nietzsche wrote, every profound spirit needs a mask. Even more, around every profound spirit, a mask is continually growing. The question is not whether you have a mask. The question is whether you know how to take it off. And taking it off is not easy, because it gave you safety. It gave you belonging. It gave you a way to navigate a world that did not honor your wholeness. But it also cost you everything that mattered. Your fire, your instinct, your ability to know what you actually want. You don't have clarity because you're indecisive. You have confusion because you've been cut off from the self that knows. And to get it back, you don't need to become better. You need to become real. That means revisiting the moments you swore you'd never feel again. The heartbreaks, the betrayals, the silences, the abandonment. Not to relive them, but to retrieve what you lost in them. Your trust, your voice, your power, your belief in your own enoughness. And when you go back, when you feel into the pain you buried, you'll find something unexpected waiting there. Not just sorrow, but life. Not just loss, but wisdom. The part of you that suffered didn't just suffer. It learned. It adapted. It saw what was real. And in reclaiming it, you don't just become whole. You become wise. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of integrating the unconscious into consciousness. Not to become perfect, but to become complete. And that includes your contradictions, your shadows, your forbidden truths, the parts of you that want to scream, the parts that want to rest, the parts that want to stop pretending. Reclamation means allowing them all to exist, not because they're all good, but because they're all you. And until you do that, you will always feel like a guest in your own life. But when you do, when you begin to speak the truth you once silenced, when you feel the emotions you once numbed, when you express the creativity you once judged, something shifts, slowly, subtly. You begin to come home, not to a version of yourself that impresses others, but to the version that you lost touch with, the one that knows who you are, even when you don't. And that homecoming, quiet, unglamorous, and often invisible to others, is what healing really looks like. It's not something you can post about. It's not something that earns applause. But it's what your soul has been begging for. And if you listen closely, it still is. There will come a point in your return to the forgotten self where you realize this is not just about healing. It's about responsibility. The parts of you you've disowned have power, real power. And if you do not reclaim them, they will control you from the shadows. This is the silent cost of forgetting what is suppressed becomes distorted. What is buried returns as fate. You don't just forget your anger. You project it onto others. You don't just forget your desires. You chase them through other people. You don't just forget your truth. You lose the ability to even recognize it. And so your life becomes a maze filled with patterns you don't understand, emotions you can't escape, and relationships that repeat the original wound again and again. Not because you're cursed, but because your soul is demanding resolution. This is why Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. What you have forgotten is not gone. It is living in the background of every choice you make, and if you do not reclaim it consciously, it will reclaim you unconsciously. Through sabotage, through longing, through depression that has no clear cause, through anxiety that seems to come from nowhere. These are not enemies. They are messengers, signals that your inner life is starving for authenticity. And the only way forward is through reckoning. To reckon with the parts of you you've forgotten, you must admit how they've shaped your reality in their absence. Ask yourself, what have I tolerated because I forgot my worth? What have I chased because I forgot my power? What have I feared because I forgot my strength? What have I repeated because I forgot I could choose differently? These are not gentle questions. They are mirrors. And they will show you everything you didn't want to see. But if you're brave enough to look, you'll begin to notice the architecture of your inner prison. Not the external world, not other people, but the internal agreements you made long ago just to feel safe. Maybe you agreed to stay small, to be nice, to avoid conflict, to always be useful, to never ask for too much. Maybe you agreed to succeed, to prove your value, to please, to be loved, to hide your sadness so no one would leave. These strategies made sense at the time. They were intelligent responses to a painful environment. But you are not in that environment anymore. And every day you keep living by those rules, you keep the past alive. The parts of you you've forgotten are the ones who made those rules, and now they are the ones who must unmake them. But unmaking requires confrontation, not with others, but with yourself. With the ways you've avoided the truth. With the ways you've blamed others for the boundaries you never set. With the ways you've played the victim because it was easier than owning your voice. With the ways you've rejected parts of yourself because they made other people uncomfortable. And here is where the reclamation becomes real, not poetic, not symbolic, but tangible. Because now you have to act, not from habit, not from fear, but from wholeness. And wholeness will cost you the comfort of who you used to be. You will begin saying no when you used to say yes. You will speak up even when your voice shakes. You will disappoint people who benefited from your forgetting. You will feel guilt, fear, even panic, not because you're doing it wrong, but because you're waking up. This is what awakening feels like. Not bliss, not certainty, but resistance from within and without. And if you push through it, if you continue despite the inner tremble, you will reach a point that no one else can give you and no one else can take away. You will reclaim your autonomy. Autonomy is not just freedom from others. It is freedom from the unconscious contracts you made when you were young. Contracts that said, I'll be who you need me to be, just don't leave. I'll succeed, just love me. I'll stay quiet, just don't hurt me. These are the roots of your forgetting. But you don't have to honor those contracts anymore. You can rewrite them. You can say, I will not betray myself to be accepted. I will not shrink to be safe. I will not abandon my truth to keep the peace. And in doing so, you begin the return to integrity, not the kind that comes from morality, but the kind that comes from alignment. Integrity means that your outer life reflects your inner truth, that what you say is what you mean, that how you act is how you feel, that who you are privately is who you are publicly. And this kind of integrity is rare, because it requires remembering all the parts of you, even the ones that others would rather you forget. But when you remember them, when you welcome them back into your being, something astonishing happens. You stop seeking permission to exist. You stop apologizing for your presence. You stop begging for validation. And you begin to move from a different place, a deeper place, the place that knows you are already enough. That's what reclamation gives you. Not perfection, not endless happiness, but wholeness. And with it, the quiet power to walk through the world without needing to prove anything. Because you are no longer performing. You are no longer pretending. You are no longer running from yourself. You are home. In the end, the question is not whether you will ever remember who you are. The question is whether you are willing to live with the consequences of continuing to forget. Because forgetting may feel easier, but it comes with a cost, a quiet erosion of your soul. You lose passion and don't know why. You lose clarity, identity, energy. You become numb, tired, disoriented, like someone drifting through a life that technically works, but feels like it belongs to someone else. And this is the true tragedy of the forgotten self. Not that it disappeared, but that it was replaced by roles, by expectations, by masks you learned to wear so convincingly that even you started to believe them. But the soul cannot be tricked. It knows when you've wandered too far, and eventually it will demand to be found. That demand doesn't come in words. It comes in crisis, in moments that shatter the illusion, a breakup that rips through your false sense of identity, a burnout so total it forces you to stop, a loss so deep it punctures the armor. Or sometimes it's something quieter, a growing dissatisfaction, a sense that something essential is missing, even if you can't name it. These are the threshold moments. The moments that invite you or confront you with the need to return. Not to who you were, but to who you always were, beneath the forgetting. And this is the sacred irony of reclamation. You are not becoming someone new. You are unlearning who you were never meant to be. You are shedding the layers you wrapped around your soul for protection. You are peeling back the compromises, the performances, the lies. And at the center of that unraveling, something pure begins to emerge. Not polished, not impressive, but real. The self that was buried under years of adaptation. The self that still remembers how to feel, how to speak, how to want, and most importantly, how to be. That self does not fit into every room, does not please every person. It does not obey every rule. But it breathes, it feels, it lives. And that aliveness, raw and unfiltered, is what you've been searching for. Not in others, not in outcomes, but within. The people you couldn't let go of, the dreams you were obsessed with, the validation you kept chasing, they were all reflections of what you forgot in yourself. And once you reclaim it, the chase ends. Because you realize what you wanted wasn't out there. It was always in here, in the part of you you silenced, abandoned, or denied, now returned. So the real work of remembering is not in becoming more. It is in becoming true. And truth once seen cannot be unseen. Once you feel what it's like to live from your center, to speak with your full voice, to choose without guilt or shame, you will never again be satisfied with a life of pretending. That doesn't mean you'll never struggle. It means you'll struggle honestly, with open eyes and an unhidden heart. And that is what makes the difference, not perfection, but presence. Not certainty, but sincerity. Not control, but contact with reality. This is what wholeness gives you. Not a guarantee, but a ground. A place inside yourself that no one can take. No matter who leaves, no matter what changes, no matter how uncertain life becomes, you know where you are. Because you know who you are. And if you forget again, you know how to find your way back. That is the gift of reclamation. Not a destination, but a compass. A memory that lives in your bones. A truth that can be felt, not just known. And still, there is one final silence. You must face the silence of what will never return. Because some parts were forgotten too long. Some dreams died while waiting. Some relationships depended on your amnesia. And once you remember, you will outgrow them. This is the quiet grief of awakening the realization that you can never unknow what you now see. You will mourn the time you lost the parts of you that were never seen the life you lived for others. And that grief will hurt. But it will also purify you. It will burn away the illusion that anything but your truth was ever enough. So what remains if you don't remember a life of quiet desperation masked by productivity? A self-deluded bent split into fragments. An endless ache that something is missing but no language to name it. And what remains if you do not bliss? Not control, but wholeness. The quiet strength of someone who is no longer hiding. The fierce gentleness of someone who finally belongs to themselves. The strange peace of someone who can look in the mirror and say, not with pride, not with ego, but with clarity, I am home. And that more than anything is what you've been seeking. Not success, not perfection, but home. Not a place, a presence, a reunion with the self you left behind. And now, if you're ready, the door is open. The silence is waiting. And your forgotten parts, the wild, the soft, the angry, the strange, the honest, the divine, are ready to return. All they need is your permission. All they need is for you to remember the truth about your emotional patterns. They're older than you think. There's a certain kind of pain you don't remember choosing. You didn't ask for it. You didn't build it. You just woke up one day and it was already there, silently shaping your moods, your relationships, your reactions. It doesn't scream, it whispers, and yet its influence is absolute. The way you shrink when someone raises their voice, the way you chase people who withhold affection, the way silence makes you anxious even when no one's angry. These aren't random quirks. They're the echoes of emotional patterns that were laid down long before you had the power to question them. And if you're not careful, you'll spend your life mistaking them for your personality. But here's the truth, these patterns are older than you think because they didn't begin with your conscious life. They were formed in the pre-verbal shadows of your earliest years, and in some cases passed down like family heirlooms, inherited responses to a world you couldn't control. What you call your emotional life is often just a continuation of an unresolved script. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's not poetry, it's a diagnosis, because your emotions, particularly the ones that repeat the ones that seem irrational, too intense, or strangely familiar, they are the fingerprints of unconscious memories. The nervous system remembers what the mind forgets. And the child you were is still alive in how you react. You flinch before you think. You numb yourself before you ask why. You withdraw before you even know what you're afraid of. And the worst part is, you've built identities around these patterns. You've called yourself sensitive, cold, needy, or strong, not realizing these are just survival strategies your younger self invented to protect you in a world that felt unsafe. But who would you be if protection was no longer the first instinct of the emotional loops you're stuck in today? The people you're drawn to, the conflicts you keep repeating, they are not just coincidence. They are reenactments. Your unconscious keeps finding mirrors of your past, hoping for a different outcome. It pulls you toward what is familiar, not what is safe. This is why you chase after the love that feels just out of reach. Why you're suspicious of stability. Why you sabotage peace. On some level, you are loyal to your early pain. Not because it feels good, but because it feels like home. And we all return home, even if it's burning. When you were small, your emotions didn't exist in language. They existed in sensation. A mother's absence didn't register as neglect. It just felt like a cold ache in the chest. A father's anger didn't feel like violence. It just turned the air sharp and made your body freeze. These sensations coded your nervous system. They wrote patterns in the language of the body. And even now, decades later, you don't remember the events, you only feel the code. And this is what you call being triggered. The body knows before the mind catches up. But there's something deeper, something most people never realize. These emotional patterns aren't just personal. They're ancestral. You didn't invent them, you inherited them. Generations of unmetabolized trauma suppression and silence have been passed down like psychic blueprints. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of inherited psychological material that lives within each of us. You may be grieving losses that didn't begin in your lifetime. You may be terrified of abandonment, not because you were left, but because someone before you was, and the fear was never resolved. It became cellular epigenetic inherited. So when you cry and don't know why, when you overreact and hate yourself for it, when you keep returning to the same kind of pain with different faces, it's not weakness. It's not drama. It's history. Buried, unnamed, repeating. And until you confront it, you will unknowingly carry it forward. You'll pass it on to your lovers, your children, your future. This is the quiet tragedy of unconscious life. We become vessels for patterns we never created, but we suffer them as if they were our own choices. But here's where the shift begins in this moment of awareness. When you stop pathologizing your pain and start understanding it as a message. When you look at your reactions not as flaws, but as fragments, splinters from a self that's asking to be seen. Because the truth is nothing repeats unless it hasn't been resolved. And nothing heals unless it's felt. There is a reason insight alone doesn't change you. You can know everything, you can trace the trauma, you can name the source, you can read every psychological theory in the book, and yet still fall into the same emotional spiral. Because understanding is not the same as integration. The mind may know, but the body still remembers. Healing emotional patterns is not an intellectual act. It's a descent. Into the body, into the memories without words, into the feelings that were never fully allowed. And that descent will feel like dying. Because in a way it is. It's the death of the identity that was built around avoidance. The death of the version of you that coped by not feeling. That protected you with coldness, perfectionism, overthinking, detachment, or rage. These were not flaws. They were intelligent adaptations. But they are outdated. They are no longer necessary. And if you keep clinging to them, you'll live a half-life safe, but numb. Alive, but disconnected. Functioning, but fractured. What Jung understood better than almost anyone is that these forgotten parts of us, these emotional shadows, don't disappear just because we ignore them. They get exiled into the unconscious. And from there, they gain power. They influence our decisions, distort our perception, and emerge in the most inconvenient ways, in panic attacks, in relationship sabotage, in addictions, in chronic dissatisfaction. We say we're stuck. But we're not stuck. We're haunted. Haunted by emotions we never fully processed. Haunted by unmet needs that echo through adult experiences. Haunted by the child within us, whose pain was never validated, whose truth was never spoken. Nietzsche wrote, "When we are tired, we are attacked by ideas we conquered long ago." But he wasn't just talking about ideas. He was talking about emotions, the ones we thought we had buried. When you are exhausted, alone, triggered, uncertain, your oldest emotional patterns come back. Not because you failed, but because they were never healed. And the truth is, they can't be healed through willpower. You cannot shame yourself into transformation. You cannot reason with a wound. You must feel it, hold it, give it space. And that is the hardest thing for someone who was never allowed to feel. Many of us were raised in environments where emotion was treated as weakness, where anger was punished, sadness ignored, fear mocked, and vulnerability shamed. And so we learned to disconnect from ourselves, to smile when we were hurting, to rationalize abuse, to normalize neglect. And now as adults, we keep reenacting that same emotional suppression. We silence ourselves in relationships. We ignore our needs at work. We pretend to be fine when we're unraveling. And we call that strength. But it's not strength. It's dissociation. And it's costing us everything. Your emotional patterns didn't come from nowhere. They were shaped in response to a world that didn't know how to meet you. And until you acknowledge that you will keep abandoning yourself in the same way others once did, you'll keep attracting people who mirror your wounds, not because you're broken, but because you're trying to finish an unfinished story. Every emotional reaction is a return to a moment when something vital was missing. And until that missing piece is grieved, until the emotion is honored, the pattern will continue. Because the unconscious does not let go until it is seen. This is why transformation is not a straight path. It's cyclical. You will revisit the same wounds at deeper levels. You will fall back into old patterns just when you think you've outgrown them. But this is not failure. It's an invitation. Each time the pattern returns, it brings with it another layer of truth. Another chance to respond with compassion instead of control. With presence instead of panic. With understanding instead of shame. There's something quietly liberating in this. The moment you realize that your emotional patterns are not evidence of personal failure, but evidence of inherited pain, unconscious loyalty, and unresolved grief, you begin to move differently. You begin to slow down when you feel reactive. You begin to question the inner voice that tells you to hide your needs. You begin to notice that what you thought was normal was just familiar. And familiarity is not the same as truth. Just because something feels like home doesn't mean it's safe. And just because an emotional reaction feels automatic doesn't mean it's authentic. It may just be ancient. It may belong to another time, another version of you, or someone before you. So much of healing is the act of remembering what you were never allowed to feel, and making space for it now. Because until you do the same, emotional ghosts will keep returning. They will dress in new situations, new relationships, new decisions, but they will carry the same emotional frequency. They will keep knocking until you finally open the door and say, "I see you. I know where you came from. And you don't have to protect me anymore." There comes a moment, not dramatic, not loud, when you begin to suspect that the war you've been fighting inside is not against who you are, but against who you were forced to become. That moment is quiet, almost unnoticeable, like the first time you pause before reacting, or the first time you wonder if your anger is actually grief. This is where real healing begins, not in changing who you are, but in recognizing what you never had the chance to fully be. The people you chased, the masks you wore, the boundaries you never set, all of it was built to protect a core that was once too vulnerable to survive on its own. But now you're not that child anymore. You can feel what they couldn't. You can hold what they had to drop. You can meet the emotion not with fear, but with presence. And when you do, the pattern loses its grip. You begin to realize that what you thought was your personality, always over-explaining, over-giving, overthinking, was actually your strategy for earning safety. That your independence was not strength, but a response to disappointment. That your silence in conflict wasn't maturity, it was learned helplessness. And beneath all of it is a self you haven't met yet. A self that is not afraid to feel, not afraid to need, not afraid to exist without justification. But to meet that self, you must walk through the emotional architecture of your past. You must step into the room where your younger self stopped speaking and sit beside them without trying to fix them. Just to be there. Just to let the moment breathe again. Because that's what healing is. It's not a grand transformation. It's not a breakthrough that changes everything overnight. It's a return. A return to the emotional truths that were too heavy to carry the first time. It's the act of becoming trustworthy to yourself, of proving day by day that you no longer need to abandon your feelings to stay safe, that you no longer need to perform, please, or prove, that you can be real and still be held. This is the core of emotional reparenting. It's giving to yourself the attunement, protection, and presence you didn't receive when it mattered most. And that work, though invisible to the outside world, is sacred. You will not get applause for it. No one will understand why you're tired from feeling your feelings. No one will see the courage it takes to pause instead of react, to cry instead of numb, to speak instead of shrink. But you will feel it. You will feel your body begin to soften. You will feel your nervous system relax in places it's been bracing for decades. You will feel yourself becoming less reactive, less performative, less desperate to be understood, because you are finally understanding yourself. And in that space, something ancient begins to break. The lineage of emotional pain, the inherited silence, the intergenerational fear, the patterns passed down like curses, it begins to fracture. You stop the cycle. Not perfectly, not all at once. But with every conscious breath, every act of presence, every moment you choose self-compassion over self-rejection, the old script weakens. The ghosts lose their language. The unconscious patterns that ran your life begin to dissolve into awareness. And from that awareness, something new can be born. It won't feel like victory. It will feel like grief. Grief for the years spent surviving, for the relationships built on fear, for the joy that was deferred. And that grief must be allowed, not rushed. Because buried inside it is your truth, not the truth given to you by your family, your culture, your pain, but the truth you've always carried beneath it all. The emotional self that was never broken, only buried. And as that self begins to surface, everything changes. Your standards shift. Your language changes. You no longer explain your boundaries. You no longer apologize for your sensitivity. You no longer seek validation from those who never saw you. Because you are seeing yourself. And not just the version you show the world, but the version who was abandoned and is still learning to come back home. There's a quiet reckoning that happens when you no longer rush to fix your pain. When you finally understand that your emotional patterns are not errors to be corrected, but messages to be heard. You begin to see your life not as a mistake, but as a map, a living testament to everything you've endured, everything your ancestors endured, everything that's still trying to heal through you. And in that recognition, your suffering gains a kind of dignity. Not because it was fair, not because it made you stronger, but because it was real, and because you chose to face it instead of pass it on. Most people won't. Most people will stay trapped in their loops, not because they want to, but because breaking a pattern means breaking an identity. And for many, that's too terrifying. It's easier to stay in pain than to step into uncertainty. It's easier to keep blaming others than to feel what we've avoided. And so the patterns remain. Repetition replaces resolution. Numbness becomes normal. And the unconscious keeps directing the play. But you, if you're here listening to this, you are not most people. You've already begun the process. The moment you questioned why your emotions always follow the same path, the moment you realized your pain might be older than your memories, the moment you stopped calling your triggers flaws and started seeing them as flashbacks, that was the turning point. That was the threshold between unconscious life and conscious becoming. This journey doesn't end in perfection. It ends in presence, in learning to stay with yourself when you feel ashamed, in refusing to abandon yourself when you feel unlovable, in choosing again and again to meet your reactions with awareness rather than judgment. Because awareness is what rewrites the code. When the unconscious becomes conscious, as Jung taught, fate turns into freedom. Not immediate, not effortless, but real. There will still be days when your old patterns whisper louder than your new wisdom. Days when you crave the familiar pain because it's easier than unfamiliar peace. That's part of the work. Not erasing the past, but relating to it differently. Not destroying the inner child, but listening to them, holding them, giving them the life they didn't get the first time. A life where feelings are safe, where silence isn't abandonment, where love isn't conditional. You don't do this work to become someone new. You do it to remember who you were before the world taught you to forget. Beneath the defenses, beneath the trauma responses, beneath the coping strategies, there is a self untouched by all of it. A self that's been waiting, watching, quietly guiding you back. This is why your emotional patterns matter. Not because they define you, but because they reveal you. They are the breadcrumbs left by the unconscious, pointing the way home. They show you where you were wounded, yes, but also where you are ready to heal. And healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating. Taking what was once fragmented and making it whole. Taking what was once hidden and bringing it into the light. If you choose this path, the path of conscious feeling, of emotional reckoning, of breaking ancestral cycles, you will lose things. You'll lose the comfort of avoidance. You'll lose relationships that depended on your self-abandonment. You'll lose the identity that told you you were broken. But what remains is real. What remains is you, no longer a puppet of the past, no longer a prisoner of old wounds, but a sovereign being rooted in awareness, capable of holding all your parts, the terrified child, the grieving adult, the emerging soul, without running, without flinching, without lying. Because now you know the truth about your emotional patterns is that they're not just personal. They are historical. They are symbolic. They are sacred. And they are waiting, always waiting for you to stop performing, stop escaping, stop forgetting, and finally say, I see you. I feel you. You belong. And in that moment, the pattern doesn't just stop. It transforms. It becomes the beginning of a new story. You are not just your ego. Carl Jung on the deep self. There's a moment, Maybe it happened in a quiet room after someone left you, or when you looked in the mirror too long, when something inside you whispered, "This isn't really me." You couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like your reflection was just a mask. Like your name, your ambitions, your story weren't the whole truth. Just the shell of something older, deeper, more invisible. You felt the hollowness, that subtle ache behind the performance of everyday life. And in that moment, even if it only lasted a second, you glimpsed what Carl Jung called the deep self. The part of you that doesn't wear masks. The part of you that dreams when you're awake. The part of you that never speaks in words, but screams in silence. The part of you that remembers who you were before the world told you who to be. Most people live entirely in their ego. And it isn't their fault. We are raised inside systems, schools, cultures, families that reward identity over authenticity. You learn to be liked, not to be real. You develop charm, not character. You shape yourself to survive approval, not to discover truth. That shaping is the ego, the I you think you are. The one who has a job title, a birthday, a personality type, and a curated social presence. The ego is functional. It's necessary. But it's also a prison when mistaken for the whole self. It keeps you on a leash, repeating the same emotional patterns, defending your image, avoiding shame at any cost. And most tragically, it keeps you from becoming who you really are. Jung wrote, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you." That's how the ego is born, not as a conscious choice, but as a defense. When your authentic nature felt unsafe, too raw too much, the ego stepped in like a mask over the soul. You adapted, suppressed, and disconnected. You became an idea instead of a presence. You became a role instead of a reality. And over time, you forgot there was anything underneath. That forgetting is spiritual amnesia, and it's the silent epidemic of modern life. People don't just feel anxious, lost, or numb because of circumstance. They feel that way because their ego is exhausted. It's been holding up a mask for years, and the soul beneath it is starving. To say you are not just your ego isn't poetic. It's surgical. It cuts into the root of your suffering. The ego clings to control, yet what you long for most is surrender. The ego demands certainty, yet your deepest growth comes from mystery. The ego wants to be seen, but your deepest self longs to be known. They speak different languages. The ego is loud. The deep self whispers. The ego builds walls. The deep self opens doors. The ego calculates what's safe. The deep self follows what's true even when it terrifies you. And that's where the shadow appears. The shadow is not evil. It's just the part of you the ego refuses to look at. The grief that doesn't fit your identity. The desire that doesn't match your persona. The wounds you buried to look put together. It holds all the truths your ego rejected so it could survive. But what the ego represses, the body remembers. What the ego disowns, the unconscious lives. That's why emotions resurface when you least expect them. Why old memories haunt you in quiet moments. Why you're drawn to people who reflect your forgotten parts. The deep self doesn't forget. It waits, and it suffers in silence when ignored. Most people think healing is about becoming better. Jung would say it's about becoming whole. And you cannot become whole by polishing the ego. You become whole by remembering the self beneath it. The self that was there before your trauma. The self that doesn't need to be liked to feel worthy. The self that carries your original flame, untouched by the world's conditioning. But to reclaim that self, you must first face the false one. You must recognize how deeply you've mistaken adaptation for identity. How much of what you call you is just habit fear and performance. You must have the courage to say, this mask I've been wearing, it's not all of me. It never was. So the question isn't, how do I improve my ego? The real question is, who am I when I stop performing it? In the silence that follows that question, the deep self stirs. And that's where the real journey begins. Once you begin to question the ego, you don't just discover new answers, you begin to unravel old illusions. And it doesn't feel like awakening at first. It feels like falling, like the ground beneath your identity is giving way, and everything you thought was stable. Your beliefs, your roles, your image starts to crack. This is not a breakdown. It's the beginning of your descent. Jung called it individuation, not the making of a better ego, but the integration of the self. Not upward growth, but downward integration. Into the unconscious. Into what's been repressed, denied, abandoned. Into the parts of you that the ego deemed unacceptable. But to go there, you must first understand this the ego will resist. It has to. It was built to protect. It will tell you that this exploration is dangerous. That your pain will consume you. That if you look too closely at who you are beneath the surface, you'll lose everything. And in a way, the ego is right, but only halfway. What you'll lose is not your life, but the false life you've mistaken for truth. The version of yourself built entirely around safety, not authenticity. You see, the ego is terrified of change, because change requires death, not of your body, but of your illusions. And this symbolic death is unavoidable if you are to meet the deep self face to face. Nietzsche once said, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. The deep self is that star. But you do not find it by running from your chaos. You find it by entering it, not with panic, but with presence. The chaos is not your enemy. It is the language of the parts of you that have never been heard. The grief that never got to speak. The rage that was never allowed to burn. The vulnerability that was covered up too soon. When you finally turn toward these fragments, you begin to recognize something strange. They are not here to destroy you. They are here to return you to yourself. The descent is dark for a reason, because it takes you beneath what is known, into the underworld of your psyche, where symbols speak louder than facts and emotion becomes archetype. Jung believed that the unconscious is not a trash heap of forgotten memories, but a living system, intelligent, symbolic, sacred. And it is in this darkness that the deep self reveals its voice. But it does not shout. It does not give you clarity on demand. It offers images, dreams, intuitions, a whisper of meaning beneath the surface of the rational mind. And this is where most people turn back, because the ego demands certainty. But the soul offers symbols. And if you do not learn the language of the soul, you will misread every message it sends. Think about it. How often have you dismissed your intuition, ignored your dreams, suppressed your instincts? How often have you rationalized your emotions instead of feeling them? These are the ways we silence the deep self, not because we're weak, but because we were never taught how to listen. We were taught to prioritize reason, to control emotion, to hide pain. But the soul does not speak through logic. It speaks through longing, through the things that ache inside you when the room goes quiet, through the faces you can't forget, through the art that moves you for no clear reason, through the places that feel like home before you've even been there. These are not coincidences. These are messages, clues from the deeper self trying to remind you of who you are beneath the performance. And yet, this is not a linear journey. You don't find yourself like discovering a lost object. The self is not an end point. It's an ongoing conversation between who you are, who you were told to be, and who you're becoming. The ego wants resolution, but the self wants evolution. It moves in spirals, not straight lines. And every time you think you've figured yourself out, something deeper emerges, not to confuse you, but to invite you further. To test whether you are truly listening or just rearranging the same mask into a more socially acceptable shape. And here lies the paradox. To become yourself, you must be willing to stop being who you think you are. You must descend into the unknown not once, but many times. You must allow the false to die again and again so that the real can begin to live. And this is not glamorous. It's raw, lonely, disorienting. But it is also holy. Because in the depths, something sacred happens, you remember. You remember that you were never broken, only buried. You remember that the soul doesn't need fixing, it needs freeing. And in that remembrance, you begin to move differently. Not from ego, but from essence. Not from reaction, but from presence. So ask yourself honestly, who is making your decisions, the mask or the soul? Who are you trying to protect, the image or the inner child? What part of you is being sacrificed for the comfort of being seen instead of the courage of being known? These questions will not flatter you, but they will free you. If you are willing to stay with them long enough to hear what the deep self has to say. You don't realize how many personas you've worn until one no longer fits. You feel at first as exhaustion, a weariness, not just of life, but of pretending. You laugh at the same jokes, wear the same mask, play the same role. And yet, something inside you whispers that it's all staged. And you begin to ask, almost silently, almost shamefully, who would I be if I stopped performing? If I let the world see what I've hidden, not just from others. But from myself, Jung understood this fracture intimately. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege demands sacrifice. You cannot remain loyal to the ego and serve the soul. One demands control, the other surrender. One wants applause, the other wants truth. And the more you awaken to the deep self, the more obvious this war becomes. Because the ego doesn't die quietly. It defends its territory. It convinces you that your image is your safety. That pleasing others is the path to peace. That fitting in is the same as being whole. But deep down, you already know it isn't. You feel the tension in relationships that no longer resonate. In work that drains your spirit but feeds your identity. In conversations where you nod politely while your soul screams inside. These are not small discomforts. They are signs of misalignment. And the longer you ignore them, the more fractured you become. Until one day the body starts to protest. With anxiety, with burnout, with depression that has no story. Because what the ego silences, the body remembers. It becomes the last voice of the soul when every other voice has been drowned. This is why modern life feels so painfully empty for so many. We are not suffering from a lack of success. We are suffering from a loss of self, a disconnection so profound that even joy feels performative. Even love feels conditional. Even silence feels threatening. Because when everything you are is built on who you're supposed to be, solitude doesn't bring peace, it brings panic. Without the role, who are you? Without the approval, what's your worth? Without the noise, what rises from within? This is where shadow work begins, not with self-improvement, but with self-confrontation. You meet the parts of yourself that you've spent years trying not to be. The insecure one, the angry one, the needy one, the forgotten one. You meet them not to fix them, but to listen. Because each shadow holds a truth the ego couldn't face. And when you allow yourself to feel what you once rejected, something miraculous happens. The war softens. The mask loosens. And the soul, the quiet, enduring self beneath it all, starts to breathe again. But it's not comfortable. Because reclaiming your soul means grieving the personas you've outgrown. You will lose relationships that only knew your performance. You will lose status that was built on silence. You will lose the illusion of certainty. But what you gain is incomparable integrity, congruence, wholeness, the ability to move through life without splitting yourself into fragments. To be seen not for who you try to be, but for who you are when you stop trying. This is why Jung placed such importance on symbols and dreams, because they bypass the ego's defenses. They speak to the parts of you that have no language. The wounded child, the ancient wisdom, the hidden archetypes that live in your psyche and guide your evolution. The dream is not just fantasy. It is the soul's scripture. And when you stop dismissing the irrational, you begin to understand your own mythology, not the story you tell others, but the deeper narrative that shaped your longing, your fears, your purpose. You are not just your ego. You are not just your job title, not your trauma, not your likes and dislikes, nor the curated story you post online. You are a layered being, conscious and unconscious, personal and archetypal, broken and divine. And your healing will not come from perfecting the image. It will come from embracing the totality, from seeing the rejected parts not as enemies, but as keys to your return. So here's the quiet truth: the deep self has always been here. It's the part of you that observed when your ego performed, the part that wept when you silenced your truth, the part that dreamed even when the world demanded conformity. And now it calls to you not with answers, but with an invitation to descend, to integrate, to remember. This is not the path of motivation. This is the path of reckoning, where you strip away every illusion that made you feel safe but small, where you die to the person the world trained you to be and step into the sacred task of becoming who you already are. Whole, undivided, alive. There comes a point in this journey where you no longer crave to be impressive. You crave to be real, not as a performance of authenticity, but as a quiet, private return to what was always there beneath the noise. You no longer chase healing as a goal, you live it as a way of being. You stop trying to fix your soul like it's broken. You begin to understand the soul was never broken. It was just buried beneath layers of adaptation, ego, and fear. All your life you've been carrying fragments of yourself, waiting for permission to bring them home. But the deep self does not need permission. It needs truth. And truth, when fully accepted, will cost you the old self entirely. This is the final threshold, the reckoning, where you stop negotiating with the ego, where you stop bargaining for transformation that doesn't hurt. Because real integration does hurt. It wounds the persona. It humiliates the false image. It tears through the polite lies you've told yourself to survive. But beneath that destruction, something sacred is rebuilt. Not an upgraded ego, but a foundation in being. Not performance, but presence. And this presence cannot be faked. It can only be lived. At this stage, silence becomes your teacher. Not the awkward silence you once avoided, but the holy silence of inner alignment. You begin to recognize when your words are hollow and when they come from depth. You feel the difference between connection and performance. You move slower, speak less, feel more. You start to notice the soul in others, even when they've forgotten it in themselves. You listen not to respond, but to receive. You no longer argue to be right, because the deep self doesn't need to prove anything. It just is. The deep self is not the opposite of the ego. It is what remains when the ego no longer needs to defend itself. And once you meet this part of yourself, not as a concept, but as a living presence, you realize the ego was never evil. It was just afraid. It tried to protect you the only way it knew how. But protection became prison, and safety became suffocation. The work then is not to kill the ego. The work is to unburden it, to return it to its rightful place, not as your identity, but as your tool. It helps you navigate the world, but it cannot tell you who you are. Jung once said your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. This is your awakening. Not loud, not dramatic, but slow, quiet, undeniable. The kind of awakening that shifts everything not because the world has changed, but because you're no longer looking at it through a fractured self. You see clearly. You feel deeply. You choose consciously. Not from fear, but from essence. And this ultimately is the return. The return to the world not as a persona, but as a soul. The return to relationships, not to impress, but to meet. The return to your work, not to achieve, but to express. You still wear the mask when needed, but now you know it's a mask. And you no longer mistake it for your face. You no longer need to be everything to everyone. You no longer seek validation like a drug. Because your center is no longer external. It lives within. You are not just your ego. You never were. You are the dreamer behind the eyes, the listener behind the thoughts, the witness behind the wounds. And the moment you stop running from that truth, the moment you let the false die and the forgotten return, you don't become something new. You remember something ancient, something whole, something holy. You become who you always were before the world convinced you to forget. And that is the only transformation that matters.